Why not consider becoming a supporter of Film Network Ireland on buymeacoffee.com/FNI and sign up to become a member so you can benefit from all sorts of little extra perks. Tickets for screenings, tickets to our meetups, discounts, and so much more. You'll find more about us on social media, on Facebook and Insta on @Film Network Ireland. As always, we are excited to bring you exclusive interviews with some of Ireland's top filmmakers, actors, and industry insiders. If you enjoy our show, why not deep dive into our back catalogue for a varied and exciting look behind the scenes of what it's actually like to work in the film and TV industry across all departments on the island of Ireland. WrapChat is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you find your audio content relating to film and TV.
Hi and welcome. I'm super excited to talk to Lexi Alexander, a highly accomplished filmmaker who has made her home in Ireland. And we have so much to discuss. Lexi, good morning.
Good morning, and thank you for having me on. I'm excited to meet the Irish film community now that I'm here.
Yeah, there's so much to discuss. I'm just going to dive in. I've got more than a full page of questions, so I'm just going to jump right into it.
Go for it.
Thanks. I want to go right back to the start. Can you tell me a little bit about your upbringing, growing up in Germany?
Well, I have mixed parents, obviously. I have a Palestinian father and a German mother, and I think in that small town that I grew up, I must have been the only Palestinian, only Arab kid. I remember my mother at some point insisting to baptize me Catholic at 7 years old, because it was so difficult to be in school. And, I don't know how it is in Ireland, but in Germany, you still have religion in school, and it's either Protestant or Catholic. There's no in between. And even today, apparently, it's kind of like this. They've now added something for the kids who are not either Catholic or Protestant. But in my time, you were just in the middle, of school. You were just flying around for an hour with nothing to do. And the teachers would always advise against it. And then my mother took me to get secretly baptized. It was a whole big family drama. And so, you can imagine, it wasn't easy at the time. And although now there are many more Arabs in Germany, certainly not in the 80s in the town where I grew up. So it was a little bit, odd kid out. And I very much spent the first, I think, 20 years of my life when I was still there, I would say 18 years of my life, trying to fit in, with all kinds of stuff, whether it was martial arts or going to soccer games. My first feature film, Hooligans, or Green Street, as it was called here in Ireland and in the UK, was very much about that. It was like, look at me, I can be just as much of a filmmaker. I don't make chick films. I don't make films about foreigners. I make very the kind of films that white guys would make and that Guy Ritchie makes. And there was a lot of that going on,
What do you mean by float around when religion class was on? Did
Well,
they let you out into the
there was no setup, right, for the kids that were not Protestant or Catholic. It was, I remember that the Turkish kids were just basically told to wait in the schoolyard. And it was just very much at the time, you were the outside. The schools were made for Protestant or Catholic German kids. And if you were any other religion, or from somewhere else, you were very much made to feel like you're not the norm. And so to avoid that, I was baptized because somebody was talking to my mother and basically said to her, here's what happens in school. And unless you want your daughter to have 2 hours a week, and it wasn't like the first hour or the last hour that you could just send them home. It would be like smack in the middle, and you had nothing to do. And so, that's how I ended up being baptized Catholic, which was very funny now because just yesterday, believe it or not, I received an invite from the Pope. I know it sounds crazy, but apparently this new Pope meets filmmakers, and it's called Pope Meets Cinema. And I thought how ironic that I was always kind of rejecting this, getting baptized as an emergency, and now I'm supposed to visit the Pope.
That is ironic. Did you get a chance to visit Palestine when you were growing up?
We mainly, my father is not allowed back into Palestine. And so, obviously, there was always a struggle, and he was part of the struggle and the resistance. At some point, he was sent to Israeli jail for a few years, and then they deported him. And with the help of some German activists, he ended up in Germany. So most of my family on that side is in Jordan and Kuwait and, anywhere from immigrants, they are all over the place. Some are in Europe, and so I remember spending summers often in Jordan to visit that part. And then when I became an adult and wanted to check it out for myself, I was allowed into Palestine. I'm not anymore, but I think they also, because I had changed my name at some point when I became a member of the stunt. I was a stunt woman before I became a filmmaker, and so when I became a stunt woman, there happened to be, and I couldn't believe it, somebody with the same name as me. And my original name is Alexandra Marai, Alexandra bint Khalil Marai, but you would only say Alexandra Marai. And so there was somebody with that last name and with that full name, and so they asked me to change your name for the union, for the stunt union. And so somebody said, just call yourself Lexi Alexander, so they remember it easily, and you get more jobs. Made total sense to me at age 19. And so then 9/11 happened, and I was a filmmaker by that point, and it became difficult to get in the studio if the artist's name didn't match your driver's license or your passport. So I ended up making it official. I said, who cares? At this point, it's probably best if I have easy access everywhere and people know me like this now. I do regret that now, but it did actually help in certain things like, I think the only reason I actually managed to get into Palestine was because people hadn't caught onto that. That changed since. I mean, now I definitely, everything pops up. My entire, history of who my father is and who I am. Obviously, because I've become more outspoken about Palestine, and so now, it's not. I'm not allowed myself. But yes, I have been there. I've been to Al Khalil. I am, I don't know if people are so aware with Al Khalil and the H1, H2 kind of situation. It's basically an occupied Israeli part in the middle of a town. So you can imagine if it would be like what's a famous neighborhood in Dublin?
Terenure.
Okay, so if that would be occupied by Israel or by the Brits, let's say, and the rest of it around would still be Irish, and people would have to constantly go through checkpoints. It's very bizarre. It's one of the most, I think everybody who goes there and sees what's going on immediately understands the situation. And this is the great thing, about talking to Irish people, because you don't have to expand on that. They know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah, about that. Can you tell me, you're obviously very welcome in Ireland, and We're all delighted you're here. Did you choose to relocate to Ireland partly because of Ireland's position on Palestine?
Yeah, probably. I mean, fully. I knew I couldn't be in the US anymore. Obviously, as you can see, it's becoming very dangerous, especially for people who don't have a filter about their activism. But there was no more. There's a very interesting thing that happened in the film industry, where there was certain chat groups that were made because of the strike, which was happened right before October 7th happened, and so we were still all in these chat groups, and I was in one that had a lot of prominent people, which was a chat group for filmmakers who also belonged to the writers union. And so you can imagine there was a lot of famous people in that. It's a very specific group, but and then October 7th happened, and things just blew up afterwards. There was basically the side who understood Palestinian resistance and why this happened and what happened the 80 years before. And then there was, Amy Schumer and company, and I tried to take screenshots before I left because I said somehow I'm at some point I have to document this and talk about it. And I did, but at a certain point I had to leave. But it became very quickly, it became clear, like when Susan Sarandon spoke out and her agency fired her, and there was the agent at CAA who was immediately demoted for just hashtag ceasefire, the young actress who's in Scream who was immediately fired. So, I haven't talked about it, or I necessarily didn't go to the press with it, but there were many examples where it became clear that you're not working right now, like nobody's hiring you. My own representatives, would show up on these horrible letters. Even that last letter that basically was anti the letter the Hollywood people wrote about boycotting Israel. And now we're 2 years in. And even on that last letter, I found two of my representatives. So, it was clear that they were not representing me anymore. There wasn't actually, for me, there was no career to have there. And oddly enough, now that I look back, I think a lot of the reasons, why I was always considered a promising filmmaker and then the jobs never turned up, I think it had a lot to do with, my outspokenness about being Palestinian, which I wasn't from the get-go. It just at a certain point, I became outspoken about it. And I didn't really catch that as much until this happened. Like this made it very clear. And, I said, I'm definitely can't work here anymore. I'm not getting hired. And I don't think anybody who's very outspoken, unless, you've got somebody like Adam McKay who probably doesn't care, but he's one of the very few that also probably can afford not to get hired or not to be in business with certain people. I am unfortunately not rich, so it became very clear to me that I can't draw a pension yet, and I'm not getting hired, so I have to figure something else out. And given that I didn't really have a plan B, and this is what I do, I said I have to go into a community where people still make TV and movies, but are not basically completely anti-Palestinian. And obviously Ireland was, probably the only choice. I mean, Spanish friends would reach out and say, look, we are, also supportive and you should consider. And it's a bummer because really in the years of being in Los Angeles, I should have learned Spanish, but I didn't. So I was like, is this really, am I going to stand there and direct people in English on their shows? I'm not sure that's feasible. So Ireland it was. And also Ireland was very, my cultural visa was really kind of granted fairly quickly. And it made me feel really good because I wasn't feeling that good in Hollywood at the time. And so to just have people say, yeah, we actually would love to have you here. It was nice,
Yeah, sure. You're living in Cork. Are you enjoying it?
I do. I think I know everybody I know in the film industry is in Dublin. And there's weekly emails about, are you coming to Dublin? And I know we wanted to do this in person. But I also realized Dublin, I'm not sure how you all do it, but it's super expensive. And I also like coming from LA, which was such a big city and it was so loud and so everything, I had this like, vision of Ireland the way you see it in the movies. And I live in Bantry, which is just like when you see one of those beautiful Irish movies where the coast comes up. Like I see this every day and it's really good for my soul. And I'm driving now, and I'm starting to get used to driving on the left side. I have a Beyonce sticker in my car that says to the left, to the left. So I remember this day. It's a little dodgy to drive here on the rural roads because you're just thinking this road is barely enough for one car. And the next thing you know, this massive car comes at you at 100 kilometers an hour. And I'm a former stunt-woman, driving stunt-woman. So the fact that this flips me out is very interesting, but I'm still getting used to it. And obviously there's train connections. So I have to figure out how I can spend more time in Dublin, and eventually I will. But right now I'm super happy. Cork people are very special, very much probably like everywhere in Ireland, but their pro-Palestinian activism is massive, and
A lot of
uncompromising, and they're unafraid, and it's like middle-aged white people. And when you come from the US and you see middle-aged white people, not young student kids, who are just getting into activism, like if you see like the most like very, in a sense, their life is conservative, they are not hippies or loud activists in their normal life. They're just middle-aged white normal people, teachers, bank employees, people who work in stores, and they don't want this. They don't want to see dead kids. And I'm telling you, as somebody who comes from the US and also grew up in Germany, it's very touching. It's an unbelievable feeling because it makes you feel like this is when people have compassion and haven't completely sold their soul. This is what it's supposed to be like.
And do you think, now, you might not agree, but I get the impression in a lot of countries, including in America, that the tide is turning slightly. People are more willing to sign letters in support of Palestine, like Mark Ruffalo and a few big public figures, and other people on the other side, like say Deborah Messing, are becoming more isolated. I know it's a lot of it is not based on data and just vibes, but what would you think to that?
Well, it's true. On the one hand, the problem that people make is they look at these names and they say, oh, these are a bunch of hacks nobody knows on this letter, on this pro-Israel letter, and here are all the good people. And in a sense, I can understand that the general public sees it like that. But when I look at that letter, from the pro-Israel people, that's been written 2 years into a genocide, that really now even MAGA people had enough, even like the right wing actually in the US is turning on Israel more than liberals. And so it's really at the time where you should be ashamed to sign, especially this government pro-Israel letter, right? And when I look at that letter, I see many, many gatekeepers. These are people who decide who gets hired or not. And it's unfortunate that the general public doesn't understand that. And I also think there's so much to boycott and so much to remember of what we shouldn't buy and who we shouldn't, that to explain to them that letter actually doesn't mean these are all unimportant people, hacks that people are laughing about, just because Michael Rappaport and Deborah Messing and Amy Schumer are on there, and the other list, the pro-Palestine list, has all the cool actors. The ones on the Israeli letter basically run Hollywood. They decide what gets made. They decide what gets distributed. With this latest movie that I made, I had so much drama. There was so much sabotaging happening that, people don't always understand, how the system works. It's not always super obvious.
Yeah, that's a good point. Let's go back a bit to when you got into stunt doubling. And I know it's a bit of a hard turn and subject matter, but I'm really curious about how you got into it. So I understand you're a very accomplished martial artist, and then that led to working in stunts.
Yeah, I mean, I think I became a world champion in 1994 in point fighting martial arts. And that was a kind of environment where you would see Chuck Norris at the tournament in the US, and, it was kind of just at the end of a fairly big industry that was kind of the straight to video martial arts industry, where a lot of, I don't know if these names mean anything to everybody, but there was like Don the Dragon Wilson, there was this, Van Damme was part of it. Of course, he popped really huge, but there was an entire industry of martial arts turned actors and definitely turned stunt people. There was kind of like, you would be kind of a stunt actor type, and you would be busy turning out these movies that, didn't make a massive big splash, but for a certain demographic, we couldn't wait until there was the next one in our local blockbuster, right? And so
American Ninja or
yeah,
China Prime, that kind of stuff.
exactly. And so when I was at that age, when I just had become world champion, I remember Chuck Norris at the tournament saying, "You should come to Hollywood. We could use somebody, like you." There was really a kind of like, they were trying to make these movies with actresses, and basically there wasn't often a stunt double that could do the martial arts for a certain actress. And so that's how I first that's why I moved to Los Angeles. I quickly figured out that this whole stunt thing as a woman is not something you can do for very, very long, because, whereas the guys, the stunt men would, wear all these, basically like rugby players padding everywhere, because the actors they were doubling were fully clothed. The women, you had to double somebody who was in lingerie or a tight miniskirt. And so there was no, padding, any kind of gaiters or whatever we had that would protect your bones and stuff. You could never wear that, because you wouldn't, it would be too obvious. And so I think after the third time of rolling down a flight of stairs without any, protection on, I said, yeah, this is not something I can do my whole life. I mean, it's fun for a moment, but not, forever. And I figured out what else is there I can do in this industry. I remember I went to acting school for a bit, and immediately I was in this very strict acting school. I realized there's no way I would ever act, and there's too much waiting around. And I also really don't like, the idea of, unless you're a superstar, you'd be waiting around and somebody tells you exactly what to do. There's no real creative input, but I did love filmmaking and directing. And so, that's when I basically figured out, okay, how can I switch over into that? And I think it was a naive way of like, I would buy these books from, directors like, Robert Rodriguez and like, these indie directors and, Soderbergh, how they did it, how they made these short films. And at that time, it never occurred to me that it may be more difficult for, a young woman, especially one with a Palestinian background. I didn't know. And I think me not knowing was a good thing, because sometimes you just have to do it. And I saved money for a whole year, just worked, barely ate anything, and just put everything aside. And I did these martial arts seminars because I was a fairly well-known martial artist at the time. And the US has this thing where they invite you, these martial arts school, they pay you $2,000, and you go there and teach a weekend of a martial arts seminar. And I would do that, ask the schools to pay me cash so I can like literally put it under the mattress. I saved every penny. And at a certain point I had, I think, $35,000 saved to make my first like 40-minute short film. And and I still shot. I was able to shoot that on Super 35. I literally came in at the end of everything, at the end of straight-to-video martial arts films, at the end of people shooting on actual film. So it was good, because I'm glad I still experienced that. I sometimes feel really sad for filmmakers who don't experience, what it was actually like to shoot on film. Yeah, and I had it in my head that I would make this film that would be nominated for an Oscar, and it was. And so the beginning of my career was really easy. What happened after that was a different story. But sometimes it's good not to be aware of the obstacles, because there's this opportunity for you to tumble in.
Yeah, and if you knew about the challenges, you might not do it.
I might have not done it. And that's why it's very difficult for me sometimes. There's a lot of young Arab kids that want to talk to me about becoming a filmmaker. And I'm so torn about it, because on the one hand, I want to protect them, all of them. They don't even have to be Arab, all of them. It's a brutal business for everybody. Again, I'm not necessarily talking about the Irish industry, because maybe you have it's a competitive industry everywhere, but in Hollywood specifically, it's brutal, and people will, go over dead bodies to get that job that they're up for and you're up for, So you have to have that kind of attitude. And when somebody young approaches me to talk about it, it's very hard for me, because on the one hand, I want to tell them the truth, of what it's like, how few people manage it. And even if you manage it, you probably have so much, traumatic damage because of, it's basically a toxic environment. And for you to survive a toxic environment, you almost have to turn toxic yourself, right? And it gnars on you. And, that's why there's a lot of drugs. There's, it's not a happy place. And if, what I've learned is that a lot of the actors and directors that people think get along and they're friends, like, they hate each other. You see them doing press, and, you think, oh, they're good friends. They had so much fun. They hate each other. Most of them hate each other, and I think the public really doesn't know that. So for me, it pains me to have somebody young want to go into that industry. On the other hand, we also should have storytellers that aren't, the worst people. And I think that is what we have right now, to be honest, in Hollywood. Again, I'm not talking about Ireland, because obviously I came here because I saw a little bit of hope. Like, you see something like Kneecap happening, and other people are making decisions here. They're not necessarily, and I've seen that with many other, shows that you guys have. Obviously, there is not as much funding here, and that's the sad part, But what does get funded, certainly doesn't look like it's one military ad after another, or, I mean, the Kneecap really was one of those films that made me go, oh, wow, this is a good sign,
Yeah, sure. And then other public figures like Sally Rooney and people like that.
Sally Rooney and the young actors from Dairy Girls, who I think in the first months of the genocide had already collected $2 million for Gaza. It was very impressive, and Liam Cunningham is on the flotilla, or was on the last flotilla. And so there's the nice part is that you don't necessarily have to be afraid you're getting blacklisted here. I don't always think your government is as social justice oriented and as pro-Palestine as the people. As a matter of fact, I don't think they are at all, But I think that the reason they can't be as bad as, say, the Americans or the Germans is because at some point the whole country would riot if that would be the case,
Yeah, I imagine it's a totally different vibe here than in many other countries. I hope you don't mind me asking this, but is it true that Chuck Norris sponsored your visa to America?
Yeah, he was one of multiple people. There was this was before 9/11, so I don't know if it would still be as easy today. But, much like actually I came to Ireland on a cultural visa, I had to apply for a kind of sports and special talent visa in the US at the time. I was a world champion, so we added that to the folder, but then you had to get letters from people, and that's called in the US sponsoring a green card. And so I went to, I would say, like 3 or 4 of the most famous people in my, department, in my sport. And he was one of them. And he wrote it like very quickly. Mind you, though, he did that for many, many people. He did it for the Machados, who are the Brazilian brothers, famous Brazilian jiu-jitsu brothers. There was many people. I mean, if he did one thing, he really did kind of nurture this. If you were a competitive martial artist who had some trophies and some titles, and you were asking him to say, can you write a letter and sponsor my green card? He was definitely, I must be at least one of maybe 20 or 30. But it was nice. The fact that later on, I think during Bush years, I kind of realized that he is, I didn't know it back in the beginning, but during the Bush years, I realized he's very conservative, Christian, Republican. I'm not sure if it's far right, but definitely right wing kind of person. And so we never really were in touch again, but I have to say that he did sponsor my green card.
And I read in the book Last Action Heroes. He comes across really well in it, really well liked and gentle and personable and kind. And it seems like a paradox to be a MAGA Republican and have those kinds of views. But it sounds like you had a really positive experience with him.
He is very kind. He's helped tons of people. You have to understand that the martial arts environment, unless you do become a Chuck Norris or a Van Damme, they're all broke because we don't get paid like tennis players, right? And so we rely on somebody hiring us for stunts, for this and that. And I cannot count the amount of people that he made sure they get their health insurance because he hired them on Walker, Texas Ranger. He went out of his way. He helped a lot of people. And, it's a weird thing because, I'm now also getting a different view of what's happening politically in the US, because you can say a lot about the MAGA people. Certainly, I don't politically agree with them on much, but that is the group right now that is turning mostly against Israel and Trump, because I'm still not saying that apologizes everything else, that excuses everything else, but I would say that the much more dangerous people in the US are liberals, because you get this feeling that they want to do the right thing. And, everybody that I know in Hollywood who is responsible for those pro-Israel letters, who's responsible for firing actors, firing agents, and blacklisting them for good. They're all, if I would point them out to you and we would look up their socials, they're liberals, they Democrat voters, and the fact that so many people think, but these are, like Democrats, the good guys, they want all the Black Lives Matter and stuff, it doesn't mean anything. And so it's very perceptive. So now thinking back and in hindsight, it's not unusual for somebody like Chuck Norris to have this Christian conservative kind of, by the way, I don't know. I only know that he was a Bush conservative. I don't know if he likes Trump at all. He could possibly hate him because there's a lot of the Bush crowd that doesn't like this MAGA crowd. So, and I've kind of didn't keep track. He's old now, so I don't think he says a lot publicly. So he might actually be very much against that kind of, racism. But, it's not surprising that somebody like that actually, did really good things in his real life, and that liberals, the people that you thought were doing, are all for equality and everything. I give you another great example. Years ago, some women in the DGA and the Directors Union, the Directors Guild of America, some of the women asked me to join them in this campaign because they basically had a lot of stats, and they said we're getting discriminated, and part of that is because our union is not supporting us, and to make a long story short, there was definitely a case of that. It was very clear. That's why at some point even the EEOC got involved and the ACLU. Years ago, it was all over the papers. It was a big deal. And there was a group of women who pointed that out. And they were telling me some stories about how they put forward a motion. It was a motion for a motion, like it was a motion to consider a motion. That we would get, the women directors would get an extra page on the DGA website so that people have an easier time finding us. Simple. I mean, you could just do that, right? And this was a motion for the motion, and it was denied. And the people who denied it were people like Soderbergh, Taylor Hackford, all these people. And a friend of mine insisted I must be making this up or I misunderstood. He said, but these are people who all made feminist films. Tyler Hackner is married to Helen Mirren. He would never do such a thing. And this is a typical liberal thing, So Soderbergh wins an award for Aaron Brockovich, and now he's a feminist. And yeah, I mean, he does come off like it, right? And in the press for Aaron Brockovich, he certainly has to sound like he's a feminist. But he voted against everything ever, and so did all the other directors. There was more. Michael Apner was another one. There was a list of well-known directors that you would not think that they would vote against something like this, but they did. And to me, that first of all, at the time, it was shocking to me, shocking. And then I found this out more and more, and that all of these people are just winning Oscars for making feminist movies, but really fucking hate women and don't want them to be directing anything, I mean, if it were up to them, why are women even directors? And that is kind of a perfect example of how liberals in the US pretend to be one thing but are not. And I keep saying this over and over. That is very dangerous. It's so much more dangerous than, that right-wing guy who says, okay, I really want this to be a Christian country, and I really, don't want the government to have affirmative action. Like, I can deal with that, That's who you are. Let's see, where we can meet here. But the person saying, I want all that, but then secretly in their union votes against any motion to make any equality happen, that's dangerous, and it's kind of the wolf in sheep's clothing, and you have so much of that in the US. I think there's a little bit of that happening here too, which is interesting.
Oh, can you expand on that?
Well, it just in general, Irish politics now is becoming a little bit more clear to me, it just, when you meet the people and you see people put so much effort into these weekly vigils, and, there's a march in Skibbereen, which is like 5 minutes from me, and these people show up no matter what weather, right? And it takes a lot of work, and then they come up with something else. They come up with a walk the length of Gaza, you see, this is a nation that cares, and then you have people really kind of fighting for housing, which is a big issue. And when you see that there's been 10 headlines last year of Ireland doesn't know what to do with its big surplus money. But then you have all these young people you meet here who live with their parents because they can't afford an apartment. It's just weird, because your life is almost like, Americans in a sense who, have struggled to afford anything, to move out, and then, but you meet the people and they are not like that at all. And I think a lot of that has to do that, at least this is how my activist friends here now explain it to me, is that politicians tend to promise a lot, and then as soon as they're in power, none of that happens. It kind of like apparently how it happened with the occupied territories bill. But, aside from Palestine, I find it shocking that this is a country who has the money it could do a lot for people not to leave, especially, and I'm talking not about refugees or, anybody else, but I'm talking about your own Irish young people. But they're moving to Australia and they're moving to New Zealand. You can't get any kind of construction people because they all moved to these countries, and it just like, what is happening here? Well, you're a very rich country. As a matter of fact, I think you became #1 last year, and then kind of switching over Luxembourg as the richest country, in Europe at least, if not even like #3 in the world. And I'm like, this doesn't have to be like that. And what I see the danger is here is when young people are so unsatisfied, and rightly so, and they can't afford anything, and then somebody throws a spark and says, look, it's those brown and black people, they're getting all your stuff. And you can actually show them the apartment building where all those brown and black people get free apartments. It's so easy to rile up the masses against those foreigners, because riling them up against the system, against people that look like them and that actually said, we're trying to make this happen, it's harder, because I think it's easier to fight the foreigner and make that person the target than it is to understand a systemic issue that really only serves capitalism and the powerful and the rich. And when you come here from the US, it's such a microcosm. Like, I can see it, and it's really frightening me, because it's so obvious what's happening,
Yeah, I know what you mean. There's a lot of when social services are not funded, or when you can't pay your rent or save up for a house like, say, your parents' generation could. There's a lot of anger, and people often don't point it in the right direction.
And there's no reason for it here. Having all these American companies here is already a deal made with the devil, in my opinion. But now that you have them here and the country is constantly in surplus, at least use the money to serve your own people. And I'm shocked, that this is not happening. And it makes me feel sad. This is the second time I'm talking about this, but I have this young hairstylist, and she's very talented. She has to drive an hour to get to her job, where she gets minimum wage. She spends so much money, because the gas is expensive in Europe, right? She spends so much money on gas. There's no way she can afford to move out. She's in her mid-20s. This is dangerous. This is not good. You end up with very unsatisfied generation. You end up with people getting married just so they can move out from their home and their parents' home. Also very bad, very dangerous. And this is not okay, in my opinion. Like, use the money that you have in the surplus to, basically give to people back, and yeah, it's obviously, as somebody who just moved here, it's not like I can come out with a sign and say, hey, but it's just something interesting to observe, because I guess coming from America and seeing it happening in such a small country, it's just so obvious to me what's happening,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I keep making like these big swerves because we get
No, that's
onto
okay.
the subject.
Totally okay.
Just going back to what you said about female filmmakers, you've always been quite outspoken about that, and I'm wondering what you think of the situation now. Has it improved since you started, or disimproved?
No, I don't think it has improved. I think even when the ACLU and the EEOC pretended to do an investigation, even then, the studios pretended, to put an effort in, but it didn't improve at all. Because, I remember having suddenly a meeting with the producer of the new line of Star Wars movies, and everybody is like, oh my God, Lexi, this is great. And everything from where the meeting was to what was happening in the meeting, all my friends that actually work for the company said that's a fake meeting. Like, this, you've not met anybody that actually matters, and the person who is in charge could have easily met you, because she's in LA all the time. Because I think at some point they told me, well, if she's ever in San Francisco, and it was all an effort. We are trying to meet these female directors, but it's here it is on our calendar, trying to figure this out. And it was a very fake effort. And then when we did come in with these big presentations, basically we would lose to the guys anyway. And it's really hard to prove when it comes to something like directing. you know, that you were discriminated against because, you know, everybody's coming in with a creative pitch, and you know, it's there's no rhyme or reason to it. You know, it could possibly be that that person is more talented, but when that person who gets the job has less credits than you know, and that's usually when you actually look at the beginning of a lot of the, you know, male filmmakers, you can see that they kind of popped in there and you go, whoa, how did this happen, you know? And that's, you know, that's what the EOC and the ACLU try to prove, and the data was there. But then once they started to pretend that they were interviewing us and that we just, you know, we couldn't bring it in the interviews, it became this thing. It was like, well, what are we going to do, you know? So no, I don't think it has improved at all.
Yeah, there's also more forgiveness, I think, for male filmmakers who underperform commercially. Like there's a lot of film directors like that I'm a big fan of, and they might make 2 or 3 huge flops in a row. Like no shade on Ridley Scott, but he had about 10 years of like underperforming films. And then I see female directors like the woman who made Wonder Woman 1984 or the woman who made Tank Girl, and they're allowed like one shot, one crack at the title, and if that flops, they don't get another one. Is that fair to say, or is that?
Oh yeah, that's a big issue. We talk about this all the time. And I think I was laying in bed for months, not moving after Punisher flopped, and it also felt like it wasn't my fault, but because I fought very hard for that movie not to come out during Christmas. I thought it was a big mistake. Everybody around me thought it was a big mistake. You know, this is what I'm talking about. Is there's a way in Hollywood that people can sabotage you with the tiniest little move. You know. That is the general public is not aware, and even when I explain that to somebody, it's really hard. When we were sitting there for hours trying to explain to the EEOC, you know, how you get sabotaged, you know how certain things happen, you know, for somebody on the outside that doesn't really, it's not like hard proof that you can touch, but for somebody who's been in the film industry for a long time, you know that's what's happening. And it's one of those things where, you know, you make a good movie like Punisher afterwards turned into a massive cult hit, and if I would be judged on how much residuals that movie has made, like how much it actually sold up, I mean, people, the studio themselves, they still make special, whatever they called, 4Ks, and you know, these special things that come out. I don't even metal book, or what do they call those books that come out?
Steel books. Yeah.
Steel books. Constantly I get a note. I'm like, okay, well, they don't do that for movies that are not successful, right? And this is, by the way, the second time this happened. Green Street was already like that, where the US didn't really want to distribute it because they thought this country wouldn't get, you know, soccer. And everybody, I remember it won the South by Southwest Jury and Audience Award. It was the second film in history of ever to win both. And it was a successful screening. The reviews came in and they were tremendous. We thought we would have a deal, but nobody offered a deal. And, you know, one of my producers said, and I overheard her, she didn't think I heard her, but I was standing behind her. And she said to somebody else, if she was Guy Ritchie, this movie would be sold in a second. And this was the first time I became aware of the fact that, wow, there's a real thing happening here, you know. And, you know, again, a movie that people still invite me to speak about. It made so much money on DVD. They made 3 sequels without me, right? The brand name of it is constant use. At some point, they asked me if I could come up with a TV show in that world. So it wasn't a bomb, you know, and the same with Punisher, which, to be fair, I actually thought bombed because it was bad. But then Patton Oswalt picked it up and did this whole thing on how did this get made. And then we saw lines around 2 blocks for that screening that he had for that festival right after we were on how did this get made. And it turned out it was just not marketed to the right people. And they all discovered it later. And again, if I could show you the numbers of how much money that movie made, it's certainly not a flop. But Hollywood doesn't see it like that. Oh, flopped opening weekend, you're done. As a woman, you're done. And it took me such a long time to recover from that. I'm actually in shock that I recovered from it at all, at some point. And that only lasted, so long. Part of me getting into TV was actually Hollywood's effort to suddenly hire women, because they were getting called out so much. These Berlanti shows were getting called out so much for not having women that they had to look for women, and they did. But then you walk on set and you find out that the DP was on the waiting list to direct an episode, and that he's now been pushed down because the diversity hire, just came on set. And boy, there was one DP on one of those Berlanti TV shows. You couldn't try to sabotage somebody more. Like, he was angry, he was pissed, and you could see it a mile away. And this was basically my experience on almost every TV set. There was always somebody who thought I shouldn't be there. Never mind, my first thing ever was nominated for an Oscar, and my next thing won the South by Southwest Awards and everything else. It was always like, yeah, there comes affirmative action, who shouldn't even have this job. So it's not, you're basically asking for people to make an effort, and then they make the effort. And then this happens now in the US on a bigger picture in other industries, right? Then you find out that even if you made the effort, they think that the pilot who is black can't pilot because obviously he was hired because of affirmative action. And it's also, although I appreciate that these measures were put in, it's not great, because when you don't clean an environment of discrimination and racism and sexism, but then you have these measures that push people from these groups into that environment, you're just basically objecting the members of this group, to this type of violence. And this happened to me for years, and it's just now that I'm kind of like dealing with that. I didn't actually realize how many scars that left.
And how did it feel when Punisher was rediscovered? Was it bittersweet, or was it just
It was
sweet?
bittersweet. It was bittersweet. Well, for one, because I thought, how can I be that crazy? Like, I studied that fan crowd. I went into the chat groups. I, read everything they criticized about the previous. I mean, because actually all women directors know they can't fail. We really go overboard to figure this out. And I said, what they wanted is they wanted it to be more like the comic book. So I went and I literally took frames of the comic book and put them on screen. And once the right crowd found the film, it was like day and night. They're like, oh my God. And still today you can see it. Like, people were like, that was the best Punisher. That was exactly like the thing. Because if you're a fan of the comic book, and I'm literally putting it on the screen frame by frame, including the Punisher not even speaking for like the first, 20 minutes of the movie and stuff. He's this kind of silent vigilante. The real fans, were super psyched. And then even like people of like the Deadpool crowd, who likes that kind of more NC-17 R-rated type of comic book, they then found it. And then there was the thing where people constantly sent me screenshots and blogs that they wrote, or basically, when this was back on Twitter, every time Netflix did a Marvel TV show, they would recognize that my look was being copied. And mind you, these were all TV shows that didn't hire me to direct the pilot or anything, or direct even an episode. They wanted nothing to do with me, but entire articles were written with screenshots that showed that this certain show, I think Daredevil was the biggest one, that completely copied my look, like frame by frame, right? And it was basically, taking the colors of the comic book, which is this 3-color print, right? Taking that and putting that on film. Now, I don't mind. I copy good filmmakers all the time. I'm a big Michael Mann copier, right? So if you watch Johnny Flynton, you can literally see Michael Mann all over it. So I don't have anything against that, but it's the studio and the companies that say, hey, you know what? Let's make it look like this, but let's not hire her. And that really hurts. Like it's the A writer friend of mine named Doug Richardson once wrote a blog about what happened on a film that I was up for, that he wrote, that Bruce Willis starred in, and where I and 4 other directors, we had meetings. Everybody kind of thought I was the best choice because I had this one note, and this one note was a really kind of radical note. But even the writer said once I understood that note, it was the best note I've ever received. The blog is still up, you know. I think it was called the best note I've ever received. And so everybody was, from the producers to everybody, was basically saying she should get this job. And then I didn't get the job, which, you know, nobody wanted to say it, but apparently it was Bruce Willis didn't want to be directed by a woman. I didn't get the job, but they still used my note. And I'm still friends with the writer, who was kind of outraged and disgusted by it. That's why I wrote the blog. He's like, we went and took her note and changed that part.
Sorry, Lexi, you broke up a bit when you gave the writer's name.
Oh, yes. His name is Doug Richardson. I think he wrote one of the diehards, and he very well-known writer, very cool guy. I always respected that he's very he has a great sense of justice, and he thought that was unjust. Now, he never said it was Bruce Willis who wasn't, but it became so obvious because everybody in the room, all of the producers, the studio, everybody said she's the one. And then Bruce Willis was the star. You have to run it by him. And then suddenly I wasn't the one anymore. And they moved on, but took my note. And this isn't, you know, this is only, the only reason I can tell the story now is because the writer was cool enough to write a whole blog about it and be open about it. I have 20 stories like this, but if I come out with them, everybody's going to say, that's not true. She didn't say that in the room, because I never taped my meetings. But there's been movies that I've been up for. I'm like, oh, there goes the choice of the actor I had for it that everybody thought was so fucking odd, but now here he is in that movie that I didn't book. And so I literally have 20 examples of that, and other women say this all the time. Like, we will come in most prepared. We will come in everything lined out. Here's the idea I have for this. Here's the presentation. And then we all watch these movies that we didn't get with our creative stuff in. And it's heartbreaking, you know?
Yeah, it must be. Are you still working on the Blumhouse TV series?
No, that was actually an interesting thing, because I think it's the best thing I've ever written, and one of the things I'm most proud of. And I must say, Blumhouse was really kind of eager to go out, but it had a cast of 99% Arabs. It had one single, white actor in it, and I was actually shocked that they even wanted to develop it, but they did, and they thought, look, it's a damn good script. We should do it, and so we went out and pitched it, and we pitched it to the very top studios like Apple TV and Amazon and Netflix, and not one of them, picked it up, which I think even it shocked them a little bit. Because, everybody reacted to that pilot as something, because we didn't just do the package. I had basically spec'd the pilot, and Blumhouse was really fighting to get it when it was on the level of where you're looking for what producer you get. They really wanted it. And so after then I developed it with them a little bit more. I went out with them, and they thought this would be an easy sell, and it wasn't. They had me convinced that it would be an easy sell, because they're so out there in that world of, selling things constantly. So that I was, once nobody wanted to put it on screen, I was disappointed and shocked. Again, now in hindsight, I'm like, why did I think they would put something on screen that literally makes Arabs look like humans? My whole goal was to write one thing that kind of shows a little bit part of the culture that is just never seen about us, and yeah, it didn't happen.
Okay, I'm sorry to hear that.
That's okay. That's just one of so many.
And can we look forward to a Lexi Alexander Irish movie?
I hope so. I haven't really, it's been kind of like a a very hectic year because moving countries was certainly easier when I did it at 18 than when I did it now, 30 years later, I'm going to say. 32 years later. But, back then when I did it, I moved with a duffel bag. And, now it was a lot more, including a dog. And it was rough. Like, I'm just really now kind of settling and have all the driver's license and the right PPS number and all the stuff that you need. So it's gone slower than I expected. What I haven't done is actually put my foot into the film industry. I have started writing with a very talented writer called Christian O'Donnell. He's from Galway. And so we met through a mutual friend of mine. And I said, I love his plays. He puts on a lot of plays about disabled people and their lives. And I love his writing so much. And I love how the sensitivity he brings to that subject and how much he's averse that. I said to him, I would love to write something that kind of mashes like the Irish Palestinian kind of thing, like, and maybe the idea of like a Palestinian moving here and, buddying, like a kind of type of buddy comedy, but not a comedy, between an Irish and a Palestinian person. And so I have started that. I have to get a little bit more into it, maybe find a representative. I know there's a lot of stuff happening in Cork. And I think that I'm not sure people are even aware I'm here, so I really have to put an effort now and kind of make sure that happens,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and also you've got a new movie out. So, yeah, I thought it was kind of a futuristic blood sport meets Mortal Kombat kind of affair. And there's a lot to talk about with it. First of all, did Patton Oswalt get involved because he was a fan of your Punisher movie?
Well, yeah, we were friends, first of all, ever since, we didn't know each other when he wrote the review for Punisher, but then we met and we've been good friends. And when I was writing the script for this, I thought of him as, who is the person in future who could throw out a crazy idea that goes viral and people could actually be so desperate to turn a comedian's idea into like a feasible plan. And he was the obvious choice. And, because he's supportive and a friend, he said yes. Now, the backstory about this is that I think it's a little bit rough because you don't really ever want to make excuses for a film, but there is a lot of stuff that critics have pointed out that I'm like, wow, if I don't talk about this, it's going to be really hard to explain this because this movie fell into a very strange time. First of all, Netflix at one point had this head of international movies that was the distributor of Green Street back in the day in the UK. And Green Street was super successful in the UK. So when he became the head of international movies for Netflix, he was told to reach out to multicultural directors, which I think is a great, kind of thing to do anyway. Like a department that reaches out to multicultural directors, awesome. And so I was one of the first people he reached out to. And he said, do you have anything? I was like, you know what? I have this idea kicking around, but it's quite big. And, it's set in the future. And it's really kind of a 3-part kind of Hunger Games type of thing. So it's not like an indie like Crimson. He's like, well, I don't have a limit to my budgets. Why don't you come in? Long story short, I pitched this and it was bought as a 3-picture deal, as a big sci-fi, 25 million minimum, if not 50 million a picture. And then, things happen at these studios that don't necessarily have to do with me. That just, the person who made the decision to greenlight it suddenly is not as successful and maybe they're losing some power. So now when he's being told no from the top, he has to take it more serious. So at some point they canceled the whole thing. They had paid me for developing it and then said, we're not making it anymore. We're changing kind of directing. And then I was really kind of desperate and said, well, what if we do one and I can make it for cheap or something? And thank God I had a good relationship with this executive. And he said, is there any way you can make it under 10? Now, at this point, I should have said no because it was crazy, right? Because of the way it was written, And especially during that time, it was not a $10 million movie, especially not when you're shooting it in the US, where everything is unionized. Everybody, and by the way, I'm a big fan of unions, and I'm a big fan of crews getting union money. I actually think that's missing in the EU and in the UK. And that's why the US now loves shooting here, because you all work cheap compared to the US. And that's not right. So it's not that I'm against paying Teamsters and everybody below the line a proper salary, because they should get a proper salary. But, it was also shut right basically when COVID, right after COVID. So we had to have the COVID protocol in place, which was, I think it's like a $2 million, $3 million cost, because you have a team of 6 testing everybody. You had the A space, B space, C space, this kind of like elaborate system. Also good that so nobody gets COVID, everybody masked. I was allowed no extras. And, that's why, you had this big arena and no people. And I remember even making a point in an email that I just recently found, where I put the scale of the people, like I tried to make, it took one shot, a location shot, and said, this is how 30 extras will look in this auditorium. And look, there wasn't any money. I wasn't getting the extras. I was promised that I would get stock footage extras from around the world of people, basically like public screenings in the World Cup, that I would get that. And then that kind of didn't work either. And I said, yes, I can make it. And to be fair, it shouldn't have been made for this. But I don't think there's a filmmaker in the world who wouldn't afford to make it anyway. I think in hindsight, I should have changed the script much more, made it even smaller, maybe not even set in sci-fi. But then I didn't know if this concept works, if it's not, how do you get people to fight for one religion if it's not something, an urgency? But the kind of flaws that the critiques have pointed out, sometimes I wish critics would really think and wonder if that was a filmmaker's choice, or maybe, is there any filmmaker who wants no extras? I doubt it.
Yeah.
And also it fell into a weird time where since then, it took a long time, because we then had to, Netflix and Blumhouse dropped out of the film, but they made this very unique decision, which also hasn't happened before. And I think that has to do with my big mouth. I think they were scared of what would happen if they would just shelf it and not release it. And so they made this weird decision that's literally, I think I'm still the only one this happened to, where they gifted me this movie that they spent the money on without even wanting the money back. Like they basically said, we're not shelving it, so you don't have to talk shit about us, but we are giving you the movie and you finish it and you do what you want, which was great, because this happened at the time when they were shelving a lot of, remember they shelved Bad Girl from those 2 other Belgian Arab directors and a bunch of stuff. And so I was glad that my movie was shelved, because legally I couldn't afford that, But then I had to figure out how to finish it. And there was only a tiny amount of money left in the budget. And, I had to pay some line producer. I mean, all stuff that I didn't do. So the visual effects was something that, again, there wasn't enough money. I don't have enough good friends in visual effects, to work for free hours and hours and hours. Like it was just not happening. I tried. We found this Mexican company who said yes, but I think it was a little bit beyond their scope. So that's, it is what it is, in hindsight, I think, should I have said no? Because really now I kind of put out a movie that's not of the best quality for the idea it had. And my favorite part is the critics who say, she has way too big ideas for the budget she gets. Yeah, no shit. No shit. That is correct. That is exactly what happened, but you didn't really word it the right way, right? In the end, though, I think that the reason I'm still proud of it is because, first of all, everybody loves a good tournament martial arts movie, and you can just watch the fights, and we had great martial artists on. It's kind of my type of fighting, the point fighting. So if you know martial arts, you kind of, recognize, the really good points and what's happening. And then the other thing is, for once, I managed to actually make an inclusive film, And I remember speaking to the trans community and trans activists before making this movie. And I said, I have this issue because I'm in the future and I have come up with a scenario where the men do the fighting and the women are in charge of holding all the weapons and all the military. I said, how do I not make this like a gendered world, though, even though I still have to have this scenario? Because, you know, having a mixed fighting tournament is difficult because, you know, essentially it really has to do with height and weight. Because I'm a fighter, you know, in our national team, I sometimes won against the super flyweight, you know, male fighter, because he was my height and a little bit lighter than me. But once you go up higher weight, it's a sport. It has to do with physics. Like, you know, I tend to lose against the guys, especially it would be like, you know, having, you know, Sugar Ray Leonard and asking him to fight Mike Tyson. You know, it has a lot to do with height and weight and stuff. And so, but I also wanted to be trans exclusive. I didn't want to make this gendered world and say, well, I only have men and women and they're doing two things. And they said, Lexi, just hire trans actors. And I said, what do you mean hire trans actors? And they said, you can hire somebody who is like, you know, Luke, the host, who is more open and out and non-binary, where it's obvious. But if you're creating a world that has women and men doing different things, just hire trans actors and don't speak about it. So people don't realize this, but there's a trans actor fighter and there's a trans actor soldier. And we never spoke about it. We didn't make it political. And I felt so good about it because it was a moment where I learned that the way to include people is to include them as they are without making a big deal about it. And, you know, I felt good about that. If this is my last movie, this is the thing I've achieved. I've had people speaking their own languages in it because that always bothered me. Like, why does everybody have to speak you know, English all the time, even if they're speaking with somebody who speaks their own language? And so I love the little Portuguese scene, and I love the little, you know, Arabic scene that's happening there. And then, you know, it was important for me to have a lot of, because martial arts without Asian actors is always appropriating a culture, right? So I was happy to have a whole set of great martial artists and actors who are Asian in there. So overall, I was great that I found a lead who is basically, you know, he's grew up in Germany. He's fluent in German and French, and, you know, but you don't know that, you know, like you would never consider this is where he grew up. So I also know that he probably, like me, felt like an outsider in Germany. So there was a little bit of, I could relate to him. And that was his first movie. He's a big model, but that was his first movie. And I think it worked out really well for him. So a lot of stuff was accomplished. Is it as great as Punisher or as great as Green Street was? No. Would I love to have made this movie with the $150 million that originally I was promised? Yes. You know, and on that level, it probably would be great. And then the thing that happened in between us making that and me so long, basically having to finish it, taking so long to finish it because we had so little money. And so you can't rush people. They're doing it in their weekends and stuff like that, right? What happened in that time is that everybody started figuring out how to use AI to fill up arenas with extras and stuff. So it's come out at the time. It's like, why didn't she just AI the extras? You know, it's hard to explain. It's one of those movies where it feels like, you know, unless you write a disclaimer under it, which is a tough thing to do, and you shouldn't be doing it. But you know, I think for people in the film industry, like your listeners, I think it's important to know some of these things that you don't have control over. And even when we talk about those male filmmakers that, you know, have a bunch of flops, you know, very few people have a final cut. I don't even think Scorsese does. So something flops, you don't know if how many people messed with the script, you know. So even if it's a Ridley Scott, I don't ever blame the filmmaker because, you know, unless it's somebody that we absolutely know can do what he wants and has final cut, a lot of people could have messed with that, you know.
Mm-hmm. Where can people see Absolute Dominion if they want to watch
Well,
this martial
in
arts movie?
Ireland and the UK, it's opening tomorrow. No, on on the 9th, which is on Thursday, right?
Let's just say the 9th of October.
The 9th of October on Google and Apple TV.
Okay, great. And we always ask people on these podcasts what advice they would have for people trying to get into the industry or people who are just starting off. Do you have any advice off the top of your head?
Well, I would say, be as authentic as possible. Don't look at what other people are doing. I think the best advice I ever heard was do something that you are dying to see yourself and you're not finding anywhere. The kind of movie that or even a short that, you're searching for on every app, but nobody's done it, that's what you should do. And, if you are authentic and if it is something that you yourself want to see and you can't find it, then there's probably a lot of other people who want to see the same thing and can't find it.
Yeah, that's great advice. Okay, thank you so much, Lexi. I know you're busy. I really appreciate all the time you've given us.
Oh, no, thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me and letting me talk about absolute dominion.
No worries. Okay, take care.
Bye.